How's it going, folks? Thank you all for joining us on our next episode of Topicality to Reality. We have the amazing Brenda Montez here to join us today to talk about a lot of things from debate to immigration and everything in between. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I know you're a busy person. So I guess with that, I'll jump right into it. So for a lot of our debaters, they've got all types of backgrounds and how they got into debate. For you, how do you get recruited into this little activity we do?
So before there was Landell, there was a Southern California Urban Debate League. And my school was in San Gabriel. Gabrielino High School was the school. And at that point, they really didn't have policy debate. So if it wasn't for Scuttle introducing policy debate into the program, I would have never done it. And I don't know if you know where San Gabriel is, but my debate coach from Scuttle was driving from Fullerton all the way to San Gabriel, which nowadays would be like about an hour and a half. Now, back then in high school, I did not appreciate that. Now I'm just like, my goodness, like, bless your soul. But I started pretty late. I actually was studying in Mexico during middle school. I came back as a sophomore. So I actually started policy debate as a sophomore, kind of not feeling the US for many different reasons, mostly some of the mean, student vibe that I was getting. But, it was because of that I was able to go to college. And in college at Fullerton, at Cal State Fullerton, is where I debated. And that's kind of where it took off. And I actually debated my college debate partner, Luis Andrade, or Luis Magallon, because we used to be or M&M. He was going to the Santa Ana High School, and we actually debated each other there, but we eventually became partners in college. So it was pretty awesome.
Awesome. I'm glad to see that in some ways history is repeating itself, because for so many of our Landell students, they compete against each other in high school, but then end up on the same college team. A lot of them even at your alma mater at Cal State Fullerton.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. So, and I think you hit a really important point there, that for a lot of students, that a lot will speak to the experience of a lot of our students, and that's coming into high school and coming into debate with a non-traditional background, or at least what we consider a non-traditional background in the policy debate space. And I'm glad that that's going to be the focus of our talk today, and sort of finding ourselves and empowering ourselves through debate. So I'll save some more of the questions for the end, but if you want to
Sure, yeah. So I was completely excited for this topic. Now, I think in debate every year, we would try to see what is the topic. We never had mass incarceration or criminal justice reform as any part of our topics. Like, we would have loved to have this one. So when I saw that the topic this year, I'm just like, okay, it's discussing some pretty amazing stuff. So I really just wanted to get in, because I used to be the 2A. So I was always affirmative in all of the 4 years of college. Yeah, and Luis was the negative. Now, I will say, and I'm going to encourage that in high school, you should probably flip sides a little bit. I do kind of regret not doing a little bit more of the negative. And you want to do that in high school. And if you get to do that in college, great. You can kind of find what you're more comfortable with. But I was always an AF, in the sense that I was always wanted to be an advocate. And so I honestly think that being affirmative is one of the best things. We're always kind of with the timer on having to like count down. Is it still 8 minutes of prep?
Yeah, we've only got 8.
Okay. So, I mean, even with that, with affirmative, you get to prep as much as possible. You get to do your answers to counterplans, your answers to dissents, your answers to topicality. So you're going in there really going to show your strength, right? Your advocacy, being able to know the warrants of things, of your evidence or cards. And then, aside from the fact that you all have an amazing topic, you really get to find your voice as an affirmative. And, the reason why I'm excited with your topic is because for us, it was kind of always a struggle to see, okay, we had topics like China policy, right? or some Supreme Court cases that we didn't identify with, or nuclear weapons. And that was a little bit harder because it wasn't something that I felt tangibly connected to. But I do want you to know, because what I want to talk to you about is these kind of skills, because every year it changes. So maybe next year will be a foreign policy topic. You have to find your voice within the resolution, no matter what it is. And it's totally possible. So, one of the things that, aside from the fact of being an advocate, is I really think that in order to win on the affirmative side, you have to have a strong passion for your case. Now, a lot of people think, okay, well, I'm not tied to the 1AC. And I think I know, just based on understanding the way that your tournaments, I think that the novices and JV, they're kind of tied down to certain affirmatives. And we have to learn how to connect deeply within the existing affirmatives. And it's because you're learning a life skill. I will say to you, okay, so I debated in college. I then went to law school, and I've been an immigration attorney for 7 years, been an attorney for 9 years. I will say that in every single stage of my life, from, studying in law school to advocating for my clients. I mean, even this morning, I was at 5 a.m. talking to an immigration officer. I'm using the same skills that I used and I learned in debate. So, and everybody that's debated, even if it was just in high school, they've always identified themselves as debaters. So I'm sure I'm not the first one that's used like once a debater, always a debater, but it's true. Even if you only debate for 2 years or a year, those skills, you will see, you'll use them time and time and again. And I'll share about some of those experiences further down, but you all have some pretty awesome cases. So one thing that I do on the side, just because I miss talking about debate topics, is that I teach a constitutional law class under the Chicano Studies at Cal State Northridge. And I'm teaching college students about implicit bias. And they are hearing this for the first time. Okay, and we're talking about freshmen, sophomores, and juniors, and you are getting some college level, literature and analysis. So I think it's pretty awesome. I mean, I'm having questions from students that are having a tough time understanding bias and its role and how it plays in institutions. So for novices, I'm really excited for that. JVers, with defund the police, it's such a critical discussion to have. And then the varsity, my understanding is that you all kind of get to expand a little bit more from your options. But for novices and JV, if you're tied to a NAF, you really what you're going to learn here is going to really allow you to soar once you're in open and varsity, when you're kind of choosing your own affirmative, you're looking for your own evidence. So really get excited into it. Aside from that fact that you have awesome topics, trust me, there's much to work with. Okay. So how do you connect to the 1AC? An exercise that my debate partner and I did. And again, I know that things with COVID, it's a bit difficult, but we're all trying to deal with Zoom. And that connection is there. We make our connection. I mean, of course, face-to-face is important, but we really make our connection with our thoughts, right? With the empathy that we have with one another. So I'm really going to encourage that when you're going to, discuss the strengths of your app, even if you already have, right? But get a blank sheet of a Word document, put in the resolution without even thinking about your affirmative, and really position yourself with, how does this resolution affect you? Some of us will think about experiences that we've heard in the news, and that does affect you. I think for some of you that are a little bit more exposed to social media, I think, when you hear triggering warnings, they do that because they know that there's kind of a emotional, psychological effect on each one of us, even if we are not the ones, in the video, or we're not the ones in the middle of a protest, we're still feeling it. And so when you're looking at this topic, even if you've had no specific, encounters with the criminal justice reform, think about how it affects you, even as a consumer of news, or what you hear with your neighbor. I'm sure you've had a classmate that has had, something that may have gone on with them in their home with their family, how it affects your classmates. Bring in and brainstorm all of those ideas. What emotions does the resolution trigger to you without even thinking about your app? This was something, and I'm going to mention Luisa and I, Luis a lot, but I mean, I always kid around, but Luis is like the first partnership, my first marriage. We always joke around, but it's true. I mean, so we would do this every year and we would really pour our heart out. We wouldn't even think about anything else. So get your like hot Cheetos and like munch on it and really share some of those things. Share about documentaries that you watched. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the documentary 13th, but definitely watch that if you haven't already. There's just a lot of good content on Netflix. There's also oh my God, Joseph, you're going to have to remind me, but um, about the 5 young individuals in New York City. They have a name. Um, does that ring a bell?
Yeah, they were. Oh no.
Central Park 5.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so before 2 years ago, there was like a really, it's not a boring documentary, but it was like a little bit less. It was not made by an advocate, but now there's a great like series on Netflix. Watch that and see how it kind of moves you. And if it doesn't, it's totally okay. So like I told you, like we had the international topics at some point, and Luis and I still did the same thing. We looked at the resolution and we tried to connect. And if we got stuck and we couldn't, because it was hard for us with China policy, that was mostly like international politics, we said, okay, well, what are some things that members in China are going through? And we actually we created a critical affirmative about immigration and worker permit systems in China. And the group were the Dagan Mei, and we talk about the Hukao system, which was their kind of permit visas that rural workers were given in order to work in the cities. So they were limited by a visa internally within their own country. Right. And we're like, well, if we think it's hard in the United States by having immigration work restrictions with, immigrants from abroad, imagine being in your own country and being restricted to move around. So we started researching things like what in this topic really catches our attention. Okay. Now, especially for novices and JVers, what I'm going to say is because you're a little bit more restricted with your affirmative, I think an exercise that it's not just important for you to be a good advocate. And I'm talking about for many of you that are interested in going into law. And I'm talking about being attorneys. I'm talking about going into law enforcement. I'm talking about going into nonprofits advocating to reform the criminal justice system. People that are going into social work, if you're going to be doing more direct one-on-one advocacy, we have to learn how to develop empathy. And I think that's something that is said on and on again, that we kind of get tired of it. But I will say that in more than any other time in my lifetime, which I hope I'm not too old to say this, but it's really become a tool that's been kind of ignored by our politicians. And I think that the current state of our affairs with the news is kind of a symptom of what happens when we kind of lose the value of empathy, right? And so something to really, if we're not connecting to your 1AC, you have to really learn to put yourself in the shoes of that person. Why? Because even if maybe you're not too passionate about the topic, it'll make you learn how to be passionate, how to learn how to advocate for that person, and really be able to to rephrase your evidence in a way that becomes a little bit more concise, right? And this is when we're talking about breaking it down into advocacy in a debate round. The 1AC is just reading, right, for the most part. And we read always with passion, right? We read like if we were reading for it for the first time. And that's an emphasis also with critical debate, but honestly, it's the same thing with policy. The second, with the 2AC, this is where we're trying to break down the evidence in a way that connects with our judges. And the way that we do that is through that lens of empathy. You are going to be arguing not just because you know your arguments better, but you're going to be doing it with specific policy examples. And in the 2AR, you're going to pour your heart out. And that's where you're going to be. If this was me standing in the line of, an injustice or an unjust, if I had a family member with death penalty, if I had a family member that was facing, an ICE raid, this is what it means for them. And I think that's how 2ARs win. And I want you to know that it sounds kind of fluffy sometimes. It says like it's too passionate. I will say that we kicked ass like this. We kicked ass, and this was the way that I was taught to debate in high school. And this is the way that we debated in college. And this is what won debates for us. Because what we realize is that while other people, and you should try to, you still learn. I mean, I learned how to speed, read. I used to read as many cards, as I could. But it is about putting that passion that will really distinguish you from the rest. Okay. I actually, before going into this,
Claudia,
I do want to talk a little bit just about kind of the way that we developed our critical debates. And this is going to be mostly for the varsity and the open. So it's been quite a while, so I'm not going to talk about specific theories, but I really want to talk about some things that we kind of lose sight of ourselves. I do remember, at least when we were debating performance debate, which is what we did. I started doing kind of mostly policy debate in high school. And then as my varsity year, I did more critical affirmatives. In college, I did a lot of critical affirmatives. We were still running, on the neg, I was still doing counter plans and, A-spec. Is that still a thing? Yes,
yeah,
probably.
yeah, it's still right.
And then eventually, when Luis and I debated together, was about performance debate. And a lot of people think that during our preparation for critical AF or performance meant that we were kind of doing away with the topic. And it's actually contrary to that. Luis and I went through sessions of learning the policy and the legislative background of whatever AF we were discussing. So if we were going to talk about, for example, there was a Supreme Court case, we were going to talk about Brown versus Board of Education. We read that case. We studied the history of, post-Brown. We learned about what was happening locally, at the local level, at the state level with education, with standardized testing. And then from there, we kind of went through those motions that I talked about, that we connected with it. And then from there is where we started becoming the problem solvers. So this is very specific, and I think it's going to resonate a little bit more to the varsity debaters, but I'm going to go back here just to look at the resolution. So it is important that you understand what the US federal government can do. And for novices and JVers, you need to become great at knowing what are the limits of the US federal government in any affirmative that you do. And for once you're in open and in varsity, I think that you can be a little bit more open to say, okay, the government has clearly messed up on many areas, right? Whether it be death penalty, whether it be sentencing reform like the 3 strikes law, whether it be through ICE. We are smarter, really, than a lot of policymakers. Our intuition has the solution. A lot of times, and I'll give you an example with defund the police, okay? I'm sure if we sat all of you in a stadium, we would be creating the best policy that is not whatever extreme, that is not anarchy, I guess, in what people would classify as anarchy, but also, not incredibly police, heavy, a police state. We would create sensible solutions. So, we were kind of brainstorming with my students, and I know it took them a bit, but, sometimes alternatives to policing is having a therapist or a psychologist on site. And none of our students, our college students, needed a degree in psychology. None of my students needed to have a background or a major in political science. A lot of these solutions, they come from our experience. And honestly, we don't give ourselves enough credit. So on creating those solutions. So for at least for the varsity debaters, I will say that one additional step to do with your partner is brainstorm. Okay, if we had the power, if we were role playing, because Luis and I did that even as critical debaters, what could we do? What did the federal government need to pay attention to in order for this to be just, or to provide equality or fairness for individuals who are facing the criminal justice system? And you will realize that you have a lot of the solutions. And I really encourage you all to brainstorm. So even before we were looking at affirmatives that were created by other institutions, or even before we went to talk to our debate coaches, John and Tony at Fullerton, Luis and I were having this brainstorming session. And we would force ourselves and say, okay, we think that this would be the solution. And when we were talking about Brown versus education, we talked about pedagogy of the oppressed. And this was Paulo Freire criticizing kind of the banking model of education, where teachers kind of just unload information. Students are just supposed to absorb it, but there's not enough, social location discussion. Students are not empowered to question the system. And what we did is before even thinking or finding Paulo Freire, is that Luis and I came up with this concept. We believe that in our community, if students had the ability to talk about their social location in the classroom, they would be more motivated to be involved in their community and advocate themselves for the education policy that they need. And that is what led us to find our critical author through Paulo Freire. So for critical affirmatives, when you're kind of brainstorming, okay, I want to talk about immigration. This is what I think is messed up about it. This is what I think is a solution. And you can have 10 ideas, and then you kind of, both of you as a partner or the 2A, can have more of a heavy load. Research, okay, is there a critical author that talks about this? Okay. And that's how you kind of keep the resolution and your affirmative true to yourself. But hey, Luis was always a much heavy card cutter. So I would always also be inspired by existing. There's nothing wrong by being inspired by existing critical affirmatives, by the way. So even for the first semester, I would say work with something, learn how to advocate a critical app, and then, go forward on the second half of the year, if you want, on finding something a little bit more performative, either with that same topic, critical app, or something new. Okay. All right, Joseph, I don't know if you want to break down anything else before I get on to.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. One of the students actually has a question about the empathy point that you landed on.
Yep.
I also agree it's really important, and that's sort of what it takes to sort of really feel and connect to this. But they ask, in the current world that we live in, where we just feel ourselves constantly bombarded by bad news and the sort of emotional toll that we're doing with this, she said that often she finds herself disassociating from the news just to sort of protect ourselves emotionally. So how do you think that we could balance those kinds of things, like having empathy for what's going on in the world, or while also being able to protect ourselves?
Yes, I love that because so I have my own immigration office. I've been doing immigration law for the 7 years. When I was beginning my role as an attorney, I was mostly going to immigration court. And this was when Obama was president. And things were pretty tough. I mean, Obama was called, even before Trump, deporter in chief. Obama had a pretty high record of, using programs if we have time, we'll review a little bit of that, secure communities. So it's pretty harsh. Today, it's much worse, right? And I think that with the pandemic and with just what's going on in politics, it's pretty tough. And so when I started my own office about 2-3 years ago, I wanted to do things different, because debate and what I was nurtured with, critical debate and performance debate, made me different. it meant that I didn't want to treat my clients in a objectified way. I really wanted to treat my clients as if they were my family. And what that means is that when we feel so much, we feel a little bit more of that pain. So as a form of survival in my office, because I have wonderful legal assistants who are young, either graduates that have the same heart, right? I've been very blessed to be surrounded by a team with like the same type of like fighting and advocacy and heart. But we have to we talk about this almost every week. Every week during our meeting, we have an inspirational piece. And I would recommend, I don't know how often you all meet for your class, but I would do that because you need that. When I teach my constitutional law class, even though I'm teaching through Zoom, I still have that. At the beginning of the class, we share 2 current events, and at the end of the class, we have an inspirational piece because it's out there. And that's the beautiful part about affirmatives, actually, because you actually get to research the solvency. There's actually hope in finding the solutions to these policies. And just because our politicians are not adulting in their job doesn't mean that it goes away. It's our job to make sure that we continue affirming that structure. And that self requires, yes, having the inspirational part. And I'm going to give you a tip. I mean, I do go through periods where I'm looking at social media. I realize your patterns. Everybody's different. Our emotional capacity is different. So some tips that you'll see for some people may work for others. For me, and I talked to Luis still about this. He can look at the news in the morning. I can't because it kind of, takes away from my day. But I can look at it in the middle of the day because it allows me in the morning to be highly functioning. And then I look at it during lunch and then I'm like, okay, I'm going to push myself. But then in the evening, I'm not checking it out so much. One tip that I once read, and I'm going to use John, that my head debate coach at Cal State Fullerton. Anybody that's debated for Fullerton will remember his quote, his Gandhi quote, which said, be the change you want to see in the world. And when you repeat that, I repeated that, I can say weekly, because that was really his coaching to us during college debate. It was do what you can within your social location, do a little bit. So what I'll do is, I'll teach at CSUN because I want to share, kind of explain implicit bias to a generation that kind of has been attacked for speaking about their identity, right? Or volunteer, small actions, be nice to somebody, send an email, send a text. If ever you're experiencing something negative, just accompany that by a small act of action, whether that be kindness, whether it be thanking the person that you're living with, whether that be thanking your debate partner, walking, that'll do it. Okay. But that means that you have to take care of yourself. You're taking a negative news, you have to do something nice. Okay. And that does not mean binging for the entirety of the day, by the way. But, maybe once in a while in extreme situations with no homework, maybe that's okay. Sorry, long answer, but yes. Yeah. But it's a good question though, because I think that everybody's facing that.
Yeah. No, and it's so important, especially with where we're going now. And I believe the next section I prepared was specifically about immigration and the topic.
Yes, I'm so excited. We really never got to talk about immigration. And, I wanted to be an immigration attorney since high school. So the fact that I never got to debate it as a full topic kind of sucked, but that's why I'm kind of excited for you all. But I kind of want to give you a breakdown because this is a really big deal. So I'm going to kind of flash forward and explain some kind of statutory stuff. Some of it may seem boring, but I do kind of want to, I do this even in my con law classes, because people really ignore sometimes the waves of legislative action. And that's what I loved about debate, that we get to look at a topic and look at how it's developed and progressed over the last 20, 30, and sometimes 100 years. Okay, so or more since the beginning inception of our Constitution. And immigration is a pretty big deal. I wish I could teach. I wish I could teach the whole history on how messed up our U.S. history has been in immigration. But when we understand that past, it makes these enforcement policies not so surprising. Okay, so just a couple of things. So a lot of the secure communities, a lot of the ICE going into raids and people's houses, actually is something that's new. It kind of started in 1996. For many of you, probably were not born there, whatever. But it's actually fairly recent for our country. So it started with Section 287G, and Bill Clinton was the one that started this program. And that is what essentially encouraged ICE, so Immigration Customs Enforcement, which handles the national enforcement of immigrants, within the border, within the United States. At the border in the US, that's CBP, that's Customs Border Protection. But for ICE, 287G allowed for ICE to work with local law enforcement to kind of see who of the people that were violating either criminal laws or had an infraction would be sent over to ICE. So if somebody got arrested for a DUI, or, at times, and I did have this, immigrants that were driving without a license. Sometimes if the police officer wanted to be kind of aggressive, they would tow their car, take them to prison, or share that information after to ICE. ICE would then get the details, and then they would go pick them up at their house. So that was kind of part of the 287G program, and it was created under a present part of the Democratic Party. And I only explain that because really immigration is an area where it doesn't matter what party you've been in, there's been very little love and a lot of racist policies coming from both ends. And it's one of the areas that really receives very little attention. Even right now, when you talk about family separation, I'm telling you as a practitioner, you don't hear 90% of the bad news, because it's just an area where immigrants are just not considered to be as valuable. Their rights are not considered to be as equal to citizens of the United States. And that's a huge problem because it allows for us to dehumanize them. Anyway, so the 287 program lasted from 1996 to 2012. Eventually, people are like, this is messed up. So what did they do? They got rid of it, but really it became a new program called Secure Communities. Secure Communities did very much of the similar thing. The only thing that it made it different is that it kind of said, well, as a city, you can opt in to be a secure community. So it kind of gave more liberty to do so. And so that makes it seem nicer, but it really did the same thing. It essentially allowed local police officers and local law enforcement to share that information to ICE if they did detain somebody that had an immigration status. Now, I want you to really think about locally what that does to certain communities. I'll give you an example. So currently, if an immigrant is released from detention, which is not very often, they are given a bracelet on their ankle. Okay, it's part of a supervisory program. This is given to asylum seekers who actually make it out from the detention center. In Los Angeles, the average time for an immigrant to have that bracelet on their ankle is 3 months to 6 months. And I have clients from Bangladesh, from India. I have clients from various Latin American countries. And really, when I see the difference, most of my Bengali and Indian clients have it for 3 months, while most of my Latino clients have it for 6 months and on. And none of them have criminal records. So it's very interesting how locally you see the statistics on how these rules are applying differently to different groups based on their national origin. Now, I have a client who in San Bernardino has had the bracelet on her ankle. She's from Nicaragua, escaped protests that resulted in government suppression about 2 years ago. And she's had an ankle on her leg since February of 2019. Her ankle does not even work. It's off. Or the ankle bracelet is off. It doesn't even work. So I finally get a hold of San Bernardino ICE and I said, hey, Los Angeles kind of has it only for 3 to 6 months. What's going on? The response by the ICE officer is, San Bernardino is different. Sorry. And that's essentially within their right. A lot of people don't understand that immigration has a lot of discretionary power. And that discretionary power is given freely to the executive branch because Congress laid it out as so. And this is really as a result of the 1996 Bill Clinton IRA bill. And a lot of people forget that. A lot of people forget that really was Bill Clinton who kind of enacted these very conservative immigration policies. But anyway, what I'm really trying to get to is that when we look at how even though this is a national policy, it really is taken out of control based on how local departments handle the situation. Okay. Now, in response, and I think a lot of you have heard of sanctuary cities. Sanctuary cities are cities who have said, you know what, we're no longer going to work with ICE. We're not going to just give them our information. If they want to find an immigrant, they could do so on their own way. They can waste their resources, but we're no longer going to help them out. We're lucky that Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside, and Santa Ana are considered sanctuary cities, but I will let you know that part of the enforcement is not working all the time. If you research sanctuary cities in Orange County, you'll find an article on how there was an individual who was arrested. They didn't charge them. So that person was not found to be guilty, or there wasn't any evidence to even place them in court. But somehow ICE got a hold of that information and went to go detain that person at their home. And that's pretty scary because we're talking about an area that is still considered a sanctuary city. So a lot of those, and I think this is why this topic is so important, because it's going to really make you delve in deep into how enforcement, it can help or it can work and not work, but it really has to do, and going back to the Novices Act on implicit bias, that enforcement really has to do with that. So obviously, I'm not going to go into detail because I think you hear a lot about this, but just so you know, right, Obama, kind of started talking, the Obama administration had talked about how sanctuary cities, have the option not to cooperate. But what Trump did was kind of turn that around to these cities that wanted to not cooperate with ICE. And what Trump did is started threatening their funding. Trump started threatening, we're not going to give money to San Francisco. We're not going to give money to Los Angeles, because federal government money, because you are trying to protect immigrants. And this type of strategy is not alone, right? For a lot of you university debaters, I think an interesting topic would be what's happening with protesters, right? I mean, I think just about 2 to 3 days ago, Trump issued an executive order saying that anarchist cities, or cities that can't control protesters, they are deemed to be anarchist cities, or complacent with anarchy. We're going to threaten them by shortening their funding. Right. And has a huge impact, because it has a huge impact on money that can go towards education, to medical facilities, and these other aspects. So one of the impacts, or I think an advantage that can be made if you run like a defund ICE affirmative, is this concept of U visas. So there was this piece of legislation that was passed, I think it was under Obama, but the U visa essentially encouraged immigrants who were victims of a crime to report any type of, incidents, any assaults that happened to them, domestic violence, robbery, anything that would have this detriment, and encourage them to go speak to police officers and report the crime. And it's important to have that type of positive connection. And so the U visa was created to to encourage immigrants to work with law enforcement, to not fear them, but really improve the community as a whole. And under the Trump administration, he's been denying more U visas. Even though the U visa is still respected nationally, I still have a lot of my clients who, because of the negative immigrant sentiment, they've suffered through severe assault at work, but they're so afraid about going to the police because they think that the police is going to report them to ICE. So what happens really when a community does not have trust in their police, right? And I think what we're seeing a lot of that with protesting, but we also see a lot of harm being done in a lot of homes, especially when we're dealing with domestic violence, possibly. Okay. And the other thing why, just an emphasis on immigration and ICE, why this is such a huge topic, and this is kind of the part that breaks my heart, is detention centers. So we know that there's kind of been an increase of mass incarceration. We've known that, through documentaries like 13th. But it's kind of happened simultaneously with immigration detention centers. California hosts one of the biggest detention centers, in the nation. That's Adelanto. That's near Victorville. And that's where actually most of the immigrants are detained. And if you all Google Adelanto, California, you'll see that it's an hour and a half. It's going to be hard to have an attorney go and drive that far. And it is true. They make it so difficult for immigrants that are detained to find an attorney that a lot of them don't even get an opportunity to have a fair chance to even fight their asylum cases. And, just as a point, I have an example of a student who had DACA. He came in when he was 8 years old. And he made a mistake. He had a DUI. Now, like, if you research kind of what happens if you have a DUI, this specific client didn't harm anybody. He was lucky. DUIs are incredibly dangerous, by the way. In no way am I saying it's okay. But what I am saying is that, for example, if a citizen gets a DUI, they go to traffic court. They appear, they may get arrested for a night, but they go pay their ticket. They go finish their classes. They may get a mark on their DMV license, but aside from that, they don't even get detained for more than, maybe a few hours. This client had completed all of his classes. He did not know that he shouldn't have applied for DACA again, because if you have one DUI, it disqualifies you for DACA. But because he just couldn't, he thought to himself, I served my time, I fought in my case, and I completed all of the programs. I was responsible. I paid the ticket. He didn't know he applied for DACA, and he was arrested at his home. And, before Trump, I could have bonded a person like that out very easily, because a bond in immigration, based on the statute, right? It says that the minimum bond amount is $1,500. Nowadays, bonds, even for asylum seekers that don't have any criminal record, they're going from $25,000 to $50,000. I've had a client that has had a $75,000 bond with no crimes. Even the Supreme Court decision recently stated in 2018 that indefinite detention of immigrants is okay, right? So this client that I'm mentioning is still detained because the judge denied its bond. And this was a judge appointed by the Trump administration. So what's happening is that it's not just a high volume of immigrants that are being detained for really minor offenses. But what's worrisome is kind of the statistics of judges. So if you look at asylum statistics of grants and denials for judges based on each immigration court, if you look at Adelanto, denial rates are mostly like 90% and above. Most immigration judges at Adelanto, California, are denying asylum cases at 90% and above. So a lot of these details, again, get lost And it's why it's so important to kind of really kind of put a light into the issue of ICE is not just about go getting somebody at their home. It's really about having unfair, undue process, detaining them indefinitely for years at sometimes, and then with the high likelihood of them getting deported, right? So I'm just sharing some statistics here on like states that have high levels of immigrants that are detained. And if you look at the conditions of detention centers, it's pretty deplorable. Like right now, there's a COVID outbreak. A lot of detainees, a lot of pro bono attorneys, where they're kind of sharing the stories within detainees, because a lot of times the city will go and kind of investigate what's going on in there. I've had clients tell me, oh, when they went to come when they came to inspect the detention center, the officers threatened us. They told us, you have to tell them that you do get toothbrushes, or that your water is, has access to warm water, even though she'll tell me sometimes it's either really hot or really cold. And right now, detention facilities, they're not equipped with handling the COVID crisis, but they're also not releasing any individuals. And the reason is, I'm sharing it here, but it's really a capitalist money-making producing institution. So I think like that'll be the same thing that you'll see in kind of any affirmative in the criminal justice system that we've monetized. And it's just kind of unfortunate that we're living in a world where this is the new normal, but this was not. So I want you to know that I know these kind of backstory and kind of just immigration in the state of affairs is pretty depressing, but it is an opportunity for us to kind of brainstorm solutions. And in my case, yeah, it is very heartbreaking almost on a daily basis. But I think what I find nurturing or kind of that invigorating light is kind of what my debate coach taught me, which is your social location is powerful. You helping one person is enough. And sometimes even in debate, when Luis and I kind of felt discouraged based on the way that we were treated by other teams, our purpose before every round, because when you do performance or critical debate, you put a certain part of your heart that other policy debaters don't have to. You expose your personal aspect, your beliefs, your morals, and your ethics. And when you lose, it hurts really bad. But what we would say, Luis and I, before every round is we would have a purpose with each other. And that would be if we can change this person that we're debating's mind, or if we can change the judge's mind, or make them a little bit more empathetic, or let them see a little bit of the world in our view, that is a win. And to be honest, if that was our nation's goal, just to create that bridge with one another, we would be in very different affairs. I think that debate, even though it's funny, and I'm just going to make this last commentary because I know I'm ranting, but a lot of things of what we see with this administration and with the news is that we're really, I feel that as a nation, we're unprepared to defend our democracy. Reporters are unprepared to defend communication standards, right? Logic, we're unprepared. We're like so taken aback. And debate really allows for you to practice that. And I think that we're better equipped to be able to lead on those discussions. So I really want you to take on this year and to kind of really feel empowered through it, because you're needed. And I know, and I feel very confident in the way that I try to have my office or my teachings or whatever, because I know I have the foundation, and that was through debate.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that portion. And I think that um, that's really important to recognize, is that your social location does have power. And this is a question that I've been asked other times before. But oftentimes for folks with marginalized or vulnerable backgrounds, whether it's their immigration status or their race or other kinds of things that they have to deal with, they're often fearful of being able to use that location to sort of empower themselves, right? That often they find themselves hiding themselves or not wanting to tell people their status and things like that. Um, would you be able to speak on how does using that location, whether it's in debate or in your career, help deal with those sorts of fears?
Yeah, I think that debate teaches you how to be strategic with that, right? I think that Luis and I, we weren't always just pouring our heart out or our personal life, you know, or status even, just without any basis. This is why going back to the structure is really important. And even going back to the structure of dealing with, just overwhelming negative emotions, right? You go back to the policy. What is the how much of my social location will really help this person understand? And you don't have to, like, and I'm talking specifically because I have DACA students in my classes, and sometimes I don't know if I have other students that may have a maybe naive interpretation of immigration policy. And let's say that you might have a classmate, or you're debating, or a judge, and you don't know who they are. You can always just share your experience through other people, right? Sometimes we would speak as a whole, our community, my community. And I think that you can pour that passion, and you can pour parts of your social location speaking generally as a community if you feel like you're not in a safe space. But a lot of these things, like, like I'll give you the example. In this morning, I have a client who has an appointment tomorrow morning. I've been on the phone for 4 hours, and he's 68 years old with pulmonary conditions, and they want to have him go into a building and be in a room for 3 hours. And what I explained to the officer is, if this was my parent, I would never allow them to go. It's dangerous. It's a high-risk situation. So that's part of social location that is not so direct. It's still very vague, but it shares my values and it shares my ethics in a way that still humanizes the situation. So a lot of the things that we did in the 2AC was get examples from real world examples, right? Through news, through studies. Use your affirmative as the main evidence, but your job really, or a way that helps in terms of sharing your social location without having to be so personal, is by getting examples of how, like, for example, death penalty. Look at the cases where people that should have been deemed innocent or had a second chance at their trial. Put your position in those families and advocate from there. And you're sharing your social location in terms of your ethics, but you're also humanizing it with somebody else's experience. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, especially with this year's topic. I'm sure we all have family or friends that have had their brushes with the criminal justice system, and being able to sort of empower those folks and their experiences is going to be really important. We're getting at the top of the hour, but there was a couple of questions that, if you have a couple more minutes.
Yeah, go for it.
So, one student comments that it's wild that during a time where, it's wild that car insurance companies are selling car insurance to undocumented folks, but they weren't able to get their driver's license and IDs. Are there other places where we see this kind of disconnect between the reality and what the law enforces that might be worth talking about?
Yeah, I mean, yes. And I think it makes sense when you view a lot of our systems in our country as capital gains. I mean, at the end of the day, that moves a lot of people's lives. So, immigrants can own property. They pay taxes, right? So I want you to know that an immigrant pays taxes through an ITIN number. It's not a social security number. And a lot of them do that, and they pay more taxes than citizens do or residents do. And yet Trump will not touch the IRS. They won't go after immigrants through their taxes because it's a net gain for them financially. And sure, there's a lot of contradictions of this. But immigration, if we look at kind of the history of it, and I teach this book in class, it's called Hitler's American Model, and it's a pretty great book. It's very factual, on just kind of how, in all honesty, like the Hitler party, they learned a lot of their policies, their Nuremberg laws, based on our immigration laws. And a lot of what they studied was really on the influence and the power that immigration rhetoric does to move politics. So even though our government knows that immigrants are taxpayers, even though they know that they have a really low level of crime as a community, even though, time and time again, you look at stories of like the 1960s when they try to end the Bracero program. And even I think like somewhere, it was kind of a recent article where these areas where they would use agricultural workers, they're like, we're going to kick out all of the immigrants and then we're going to open up these positions to American citizens. Nobody would go or they would quit like within a week. They know that. But immigration is, when you put kind of this racial stereotypes and implicit bias, you're speaking to people's psyche. It's very easy to mobilize politics based on that. So yeah, there's a lot of contradictions, but when you want to win elections, anti-immigrant rhetoric works pretty well to mobilize. Yeah.
That's depressing, but definitely the world that we live in.
Yeah, it is. But again, it's more of a reason why we need to understand how to articulate implicit bias or articulate what's going on with immigration, because a lot of people will say, well, we're kicking out criminals. And not really true. We're detaining asylum seekers, forcing them to wear these, pay these ridiculous bonds and wear these inhumane ankle bracelets, So we need to know those facts in order to convince, because that's the only way that we're going to kind of nurture that bridge in our country.
Yeah. So Daniel has one comment. 2 years ago, he ran an AF when it was the immigration topic about U visas. And about how we could reform those things. So the students are informed, and I'm glad that the topics that they're talking about are being handled by awesome folks like you in the real world and later down the line. And I hope that they could use these topics when they reach your point in life.
Yeah, and even talking to your community members, a lot of people don't know about the U visas. I mean, now it's more in the news, but some people really don't know, or some people are afraid. So like, knowing, this is what I'm talking about, that small political action, posting on it, sharing it. And that's great.
Yeah. So the next question, and I think we could start closing up here, but to you, what does it mean to have a performance debate, or what are some examples of performance debates that you had?
Yeah. So this was one of the questions I may have been a little afraid of, but because a lot of our performance debate is about Luis and I were always willing to put a lot of our personal politics out there. We did out a lot of aspects of our lives, but we did this very carefully, kind of with brainstorming with each other and with our coaches. Some of the apps, when we talked about abortion, which, is a sensitive topic, we like kind of read books that were empowering, like Borderlands, that dealt with a lot of poetry that talked about, being a mestiza or a mestizo, and kind of having a fluid form of gender identities. We would read that form of poetry, would reappropriate aspects of religion. And that was really personal, right? And we had different backgrounds, Luis and I, about that, but we were able to kind of bridge those through forms of poetry, because it's such that type of sensitive topic. We used to read an affirmative, during, I forget, it was a Venezuela topic. We read a whole affirmative in straight Spanish. The 1AC was just in Spanish. And it was a counterfactual affirmative. So we reimagined, what about if the US wouldn't have gone into Venezuela during the 1930s? And we just pretended that, we would just reimagine the way that politics would go through there. During Freire, we did Theater of the Oppressed. So we would perform these forms of theaters, but we would spend a lot of time connecting the resolution or aspects of the resolution into those performances. So a lot of this creativity happened by first, again, looking at that form of resolution, talking about how we wanted to create those performative solutions, and then how much were we willing to share about ourselves, whether that would be kind of moral values that we both shared or part of our personal politics. Yeah, but it was tons of fun. But we called that, in a sense, emotional bleeding because it was hard on us. But we found purpose. We had, like, as a partnership, we're like, we're kind of putting ourselves out there, but we're going to kind of heal each other after. So you have to have those things in place about caring for each other if you're going to be doing that type of debate, because it's needed.
Yeah. And earlier in the series, we talked with some folks about how to create a policy app and how to do that. But when it comes to performance debate, clearly the way that you think about things like solvency comes from different places. So if someone is looking for ways to create a performance, what are some things? I know earlier you spoke to some of the questions they should be asking themselves, but what are some areas or topics or resources that they might want to look into to sort of get to the bottom of some of those questions?
Yeah, I think, again, looking at articles about what movements are doing. So when we look at the China policy and we were talking about migrant visa workers, the solvency that we had for them was really coming from what they were doing. How do you resist against corporations that need your labor and have these inhumane labor conditions? And we would talk about micro acts of transgressions for them. We would see what were they doing on the day-to-day basis. How were they protesting within their own social space? Maybe they were working really long hours, but they were finding ways to be locally and politically in Latino culture. And what do people do when they deal with that? We look at their stories and we let that guide. So I would look at articles, I would look at art, I would look at what some movements are doing that you're fond of, right? There's a lot of creative art out there. And I think that we would have probably have different, types of showing visual aids given social media nowadays. But you look at that and whatever inspires you and whatever you think can have an effect on policy in the long run, if everybody did it, you kind of imagine that world. That's kind of where you get inspired for your policy. And then you kind of then go from there to researching academic articles, right? So do they have access to academic libraries,
Yep.
right? On just, journals or even on Google Scholar, but what academic author kind of speaks to that form or that can support that form of solvency?
Yeah. And I think that's especially true with the criminal justice topic, especially with the recent real world events with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all of the sort of on the ground movements that we see outside of direct politicians and stuff. Because as you've spoken to earlier, a lot of the times on the top, when we look at just government actors, there isn't a lot going on there. But if we look inward towards our community and towards activists and towards performers and our community, there's a lot more solutions outside of just passing a plan or other tactics to get that change in policy that we want.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, sorry, last question. Claudia asked, so you mentioned a second ago about community care and doing those types of things after debates. So after a heated debate or sad news that just really impacts us emotionally, what are some community care things that you do? Or I know you mentioned earlier during your practice you have some, but could we close with that?
Yeah. I think for now, one of the things that I regretted in the last election was not being more participatory with the election. I donated, but I didn't make calls. And I promised myself that as much as I would feel disillusioned, I would force myself to do calls. And I've been trying to share that as much in social media, trying to do like family gatherings around it, and really talking to people that I would never feel like sometimes in politics, and especially with immigration, sometimes I kind of feel entitled, kind of saying, I don't know how you don't understand how messed up the world is, but I kind of said, I realize that this country needs a lot of healing and a lot of communication and a lot of bridging. I'm going to choose one or two people that maybe are in the middle and speak to them. And I think in our office, specifically, I'm really blessed to kind of have, and I think this is debates fault, that I always need to have like a really small community in my office, that I need to feel like a family. We have a lot of the things that Luis and I used to do and still do as friends. I do it in my office. We have our inspirational pieces. We have our purpose. We talk about a client's life and their achievements. We decorate the office. We share videos on, what's happening with other advocacy groups. And that's enough because you're taking care of somebody else. Or just going above and beyond with the clients. Sometimes our clients ask us for things that I know, because I worked in other immigration firms, they wouldn't do. A lot of times they're stuck with having to deal with an abusive landlord, or they don't know how we can get a bond, but most attorneys will not help them work with the bond agency. We do that. We try to do that, or I try to do that as much as I can. But it's those little things. And I think like when you set your parameters, when you're with your debate partner, hey, when we feel low, we're going to do this. I think that you're going to feel a little bit more empowered, and really doing those things. It doesn't take away the lows, but it helps us get back. And that's all we need really in a fight. We don't need to, it's a war, not a small battle. So we just gotta take it day by day. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and I really appreciate us closing on those words, because it's going to be a long next few days up until the election. It's going to be a long few months after that, and with the SCOTUS and all the things going on in the world. But it's definitely going to be important to lean into our communities, lean into our debate partners, lean into our team, and just help each other stay healed.
Yes, and thank you all. It's nurturing to know that there's like a bright, caring. I would say that you all are warriors in your own way. You don't have to do much. You don't have to be out protesting necessarily, although I encourage to do that in your own form. But you all really give me that inspiration. So thank you for giving me the forum to kind of share these strategies.
Thank you so much for being with us. I know you're a busy person, and it really means a lot to us for you to join us. Thank you all for watching, and have a good night.